The results are in to my first ever YouTube community poll question where I asked which character should I do my next 5 keys under $5 video on. And the winner was my favorite character, Spider-Man. And so let's talk about 5 of his keys that you can find for under $5. First of all, we have 2014's Amazing Spider-Man #1, which is a cool book for several reasons. First, it's the first cameo appearance of Cindy Moon, who goes on to become Silk. And so, if you're a fan of that character, then this is a nice book to add to your collection, especially because her first full appearance in issue #4 is not a cheap one. And so, if you're working on a budget, great book to pick up. Which means this is also a nice book to speculate on, because if this character shows up in the MCU, then of course it's going to drive a lot of interest in her. And as people are priced out of issue #4, the people might start turning to a book like this, which of course will make it a little more valuable. Secondly, this book contains the first appearance of Clayton Cole, otherwise known as Clash. And this is the character that I think has a pretty interesting story arc. So Clayton starts out as a fan of Spider-Man. In fact, he shows up to his debut wrestling match before he became a hero, and he was simply known as the Masked Superstar. And in this, once again, updated timeline continuity, he records the match and uploads it to YouTube, and it goes viral. And so, of course, this is the beginning of his fascination with Spider-Man, and he ends up meeting him one day. And from his voice, he can tell, hey, this guy is just a teenager like me. And so he starts to think, well, if a teenager can be Spider-Man, then why can't I be a superhero? And like many superheroes, he's actually a genius. And so he goes and invents this super suit where he uses sonic or sound powers to go out and try to fight crime. And he's expecting to get a lot of attention from the media and from Spider-Man, but unfortunately, no one seems to notice him. And so he becomes a little bit disillusioned. And while he's frustrated, he falls in with the wrong friends and they influence in him. And long story short, he ends up becoming a henchman for a villain. And of course, this brings him into conflict with Spider-Man. Well, eventually, Spider Man realizes deep down Clayton is a good guy, and so he gives him a chance to redeem himself when he offers him a job at Parker Industries as an engineer. And so this begins the next phase of Clayton's arc, where he's definitely very heroic, simply from an engineering perspective. But unfortunately, one day the building is attacked and Clash gets his outfit back. And in the battle where he's defending Parker Industries, like in pretty much any other superhero battle, there's a lot of property damage. And Parker really lashes out at him for this property damage and says, you shouldn't have been doing this. You're on parole for using this suit. And of course, Clayton is upset. He's like, dude, I was trying to help you out. Why are you so angry at me? And so, of course, he's frustrated and he ends up quitting his job and unfortunately falls in with the wrong crowd again and goes back to his villainous ways. And so, again, a very interesting character arc where he's heroic to villain again. And hopefully one day he comes back to the side of angels. Thirdly, this book is cool because it's an Amazing Spider-Man #1. Now, this is the third volume, and like many of you, I don't like the constant reboots of that legacy line. It's obviously a marketing ploy, but it's a marketing ploy that works because everyone thinks #1 issues are cool. And so, if you like #1s, this is a very cheap Amazing Spider-Man #1 to add to your collection. Well, speaking of Spider-Man #1s, my #2 pick is Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man #1, which is the first appearance of his sister Teresa Parker in a standard comic book. Now, this character was introduced earlier in a graphic novel called Family Business, but this is the first time that you see her in a regular comic. Now, if you don't know much about Peter Parker's family history, his parents, Richard and Mary, were actually CIA agents, and they ended up being killed on a mission. But unbeknownst to Peter, he actually had a sister. But when his parents were killed, They were separated, kind of like Luke and Leia in Star Wars, to protect them. And so, of course, Peter ends up staying with Aunt May and Uncle Ben. And Teresa ends up being adopted. There's some mystery to who adopted her. And there's even kind of stories that hint that maybe she was adopted by the Russians and she was supposed to be like a double agent. But regardless, anyway, she ends up later on joining the CIA herself. And in the midst of one of her operations, she ends up finding Parker as a person of interest as she's studying his file and recognizes, holy cow, this dude is my brother. And so, of course, she goes to meet him and they have some adventures together. And she's a character that I hope ends up getting explored more and more in the Spider Man books. Now, something that's cool about all these books with first appearances that you can find for cheap is that any of these characters could show up in the MCU at any point and all of a sudden turn these from $5 books into $30 books. Now, of course, these aren't the top tier Spider Man characters, but I think it's inevitable that we are going to get a ton of Spider-Man content on Disney Plus sooner rather than later because he's obviously an uber popular character and Disney knows they can make a lot of money off of him. And so as they introduce more and more content, of course, they've got to introduce more and more characters. And if the She-Hulk show taught us anything, you don't know who they're going to pick out from Spider-Man's history. And so if they introduce these characters at one point, again, these books become a lot more valuable. All right, at number three, we had the Spectacular Spider-Man number 6, which is when Peter reveals his secret identity to J. Jonah Jameson. Now, the reason I like this book is because I have always loved the dynamic between Spider-Man and JJJ. Of course, Spider-Man has one of the greatest rogues galleries in all of comics. What I think is so fascinating is that perhaps his greatest enemy and the one who is the greatest threat to him is someone who doesn't have any powers except the power of the newspaper. And so I think J. Jonah Jameson is just such an interesting character because it really shows us the power of media. And of course, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, you probably realize that media can be weaponized in different ways, by either side of the political spectrum. And Jameson is really able to show that reality in comics. Because, of course, we all know that Spider Man is a great hero, but Jameson is able to weaponize the newspaper that he owns, the Daily Bugle, to portray Spider Man as a menace, and he turns the whole city against Spider Man. And so, again, I just think that's a really interesting idea to explore in comics, and I think Jameson does it the best. And there's a lot of twists and turns in the Spider Man and Jameson dynamic along the way. Eventually, for example, Jameson's dad ends up marrying Aunt May, and so Jonah and Peter become stepbrothers. And Jonah actually provides a lot of comic relief, and you really see it in that role. Eventually, Jonah also becomes the mayor of New York City, and then he's able to weaponize his political office to go after Spider-Man. And so, just a lot of interesting stories, but their dynamic totally shifts, of course, here when Peter reveals his secret identity, because for the first time, Jameson becomes an ally of Spider-Man. And along the way, there's still a lot of comedic relief because he tries to help Spider-Man, and often he ends up actually hurting him in different ways. But that whole storyline, that whole shift in their dynamic begins with this book, so I think it's a cool one to add to your collection. Well, at number 4, we have The Amazing Spider-Man number 418, which is when Peter and Mary discover that their child is stillborn. And as a father, I really feel his pain here, and I think this is perhaps the most tragic event in a life of tragedies that Peter has had. And as a father, I really feel Peter's pain here. And I think it's one of the greatest tragedies and what is a lifetime of tragedies for Peter. I mean, there's not much more painful than losing a child. As they say, children are supposed to bury their parents, parents are not supposed to bury their children. And so I just think it's a really important part of his story and of his relationship with Mary Jane. But this book is also important because this storyline is explored more in What If number 105, which asks the question, what if Mary Jane had not lost the baby? And so you end up being introduced to Mayday Parker, who ends up becoming Spider Girl. And this story is so well received that Spider-Girl ends up receiving several solo series set in a different continuity and is now set to appear in the upcoming Into the Spider-Verse movie. But it all originated in this story of Amazing Spider-Man number 418. And finally, that brings me to my fifth pick, which is Web of Spider-Man number 100, which contains the debut of the first of many spider armors. So, what happens in this issue is that Spider Man is in the midst of a conflict with the new enforcers, and he realizes, hey, his spidey senses aren't going to be enough to deal with as many guns as they have. He can't move but so much, and so he develops this armor to resist them, and it works. And of course, it's kind of a clunky armor, but it's the first of many spider armors. But they all got their start right here. And I personally especially like this issue because it has a lot of nostalgia for me. Because I bought this issue off the rack as a kid, and it's the epitome of '90s gimmick covers, and so I just have a bias towards this book. But I think there's also a chance that it could rise in value one day if you ever see any form of spider armor show up in the MCU. As you might know, when the Iron Spider suit showed up in the MCU, the comic book that it debuted in became a $30 book instead of a $5 book. And so if you have any form of the spider armor show up in the MCU, which I certainly wouldn't bank on this first edition showing up just because of how clunky it looks, then maybe people say, well, might not be the spider armor that I see on screen, but I really want the very first spider armor. And so they go chasing after this book and it spikes and becomes really valuable. Now, I would not count on that happening, but who knows? It could. Stranger things have happened, but regardless, this is a cool, fun book to add to your collection for only $5. Well, that brings us to an end of the video. Of course, if you haven't subscribed, I'd appreciate if you'd consider doing so and helping us to get to 500 subscribers so that I can give away 5 copies of Spider-Woman number 1, and you can get an entry in that drawing simply by subscribing and leaving a comment. Now, it's been a little frustrating because I actually passed the 500 mark on New Year's Eve, but unfortunately that night I lost 7 subscribers. And I think it's because YouTube unsubscribed at least most of them from me without them doing anything. Because on that very same night, I know that YouTube unsubscribed me from some other channels. I don't know why they do that, but that happens sometimes. It's a frustration from a content creator. So I fell back below 500. At recording this video, I'm at 499. And so I only need one of you to subscribe. Hopefully more of you will, but one of you will trigger that giveaway. So help me get some cool books into some collectors' hands. Of course, I'd also love if you leave a comment. Tell me which of these 5 books you like the most, or let me know of another cool $5 Spider-Man key that I can be looking to add to my collection. And like the video, all those things that help this channel to grow. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to watch it. I enjoyed it, and as always, I look forward to the next one.